Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So welcome to our webinar. Today we'll be trying to talk a little bit about how to write a good hypothesis, how to formulate a hypothesis. So that's the idea. And as I said before, maybe you have not, all of you have not joined. Please ask questions. While I'm talking, you can ask questions. So it's not bothering me. Just you don't even have to raise your hands or whatsoever. Just cut directly in there and I will actually answer all your questions. So let us really have a nice interactive session because it's for you, it's not for me. You know, I can preach and preach and preach for hours, but I would like that actually all of us have something, some benefits at the end of this webinar. So what I would like to talk today about is kind of about generally how to formulate a well-written hypothesis and then try to see how these hypotheses are kind of linked to the research questions. In one slide or two slides, I'll go even farther. I'll talk even about link to the title, but definitely to the research question. And then we can actually even talk something about selected methodology, because this is an extremely important thing. If you see here, let me go with the laser pointer. We see here, I mean, you have done probably most of this part. You have selected the area, you have selected your research topic, you have probably defined your kind of, crude, he's written here, research questions. You have done some more reading, you know, all the literature about your topic, and you have defined your research questions. After you have defined the research questions, we usually ask, okay, now it's the time to build your framework. And whenever we are finishing actually the framework, so many ideas are there actually, and you can in a way see what are your hypotheses or what are your potential hypotheses. So that's kind of the way how we are slowly reaching to the hypothesis. And about that we'll be just talking right now. So as we said, it's a little bit different, I don't know. You have found your unique research question. That's what we said. Let us say you have. As I said, I don't know at what stages most of you are right now at, but let us say you have actually defined your research question. Then I mentioned the theoretical or conceptual framework. Probably you have done it. Is that correct? I hope you have, because based on that, you will be probably thinking with me, you'll be following much better actually what we are discussing right now. So you have your conceptual framework. That's kind of one picture, let's say, of a framework I'll be using today in order to explain some of the things. Now is the time, as I said, to talk or to think about the hypothesis. So the idea behind it is that you are trying to understand or trying to suggest, trying to propose which of those, let's say, should I say boxes, or should I say constructs, or should I say variables are linked together, and especially which ones you would like to present, you would like to test. So we have to find hypotheses. We have to define hypotheses. And that is actually kind of presented on the next slide, where we see we have hypothesis 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's really up to you how many hypotheses will you be having. It is kind of linked to your framework usually, and it is linked to that, what you are trying actually to test, to show that something is true, that the relationship between two variables is actually given, and you can test it and say, okay, that linkage is strong, or that linkage is significant, that linkage is whatever you will be kind of doing, positive, negative, and things like that. Okay, so that's kind of the way how we come close to our hypothesis. But the last bullet point says, and I mean, you know that it is important how to write a hypothesis in a correct way. Okay, that means that's what we are trying to talk today. So as I said, I hope you have done most of the previous 3 steps. So now we can focus mostly on the hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? How we can write it in a proper, clear, actually focused way. Okay, are we fine right now? Everything is, I guess, clear. If not, as I said, really come back, ask question, and let us talk. I would really like that at the end, all of us are understanding what I was trying actually to tell you.
Bastian, could you provide me with an example? What is a hypothesis exactly? Or do you still come to that?
It will come, yeah, definitely. I'll talk about that. Now, a few, should I say, boring definitions, but I will just try to point out few or three or four kind of most important parts of those hypotheses. So the hypotheses are predictions. So predictions from the point of view that they are saying what you are trying to research, what are you trying actually to test, what are you trying to present as a relationship. Here we have word relation. Here we have actually a relationship. That means based, let's say, on the framework, you can say implementation enablers are positively influencing sustainability exploration. That would be kind of practices. That would be hypothesis 2. If we go actually to the hypothesis 3, we would say sustainability exploitation practices are, for example, negatively influencing the performance output. Okay, maybe have I answered your question, Andreas, in a way? So the idea is always that we are kind of trying to predict what will be the outcome of our research. And based on the hypothesis, we will then say, true, I can actually accept this, prove this hypothesis, or no, I cannot, I have to reject it. Okay, but it is always kind of a linkage. It's a relation between two, if you want, boxes, if you want constructs, if you want variables. And I'll go deeper into that. So a hypothesis is a statement that can be tested using research, okay, scientific research. That's extremely important. I'll talk about testing a little bit later, but that's extremely important. As Zara has just said, she has already tested her hypothesis. Okay, perfectly fine. So she has used some tools, sometimes statistical, most of the time statistical tools, in order to test them. And then she knows whether that relationship is now there. She can prove it, or she can actually say, unfortunately, that's not there. But that's a good result as well. Maybe I can say that if you get actually some results which are not proving your hypothesis, that does not mean that you have done something wrong generally. So hypothesis is a logical prediction that something will happen, okay, based on your predictions, as we said. And using the empirical, let's say, study, you will have the confirmation or evidence that this prediction, as we said, is true or is not true. So if you go a little bit farther, we will say you can test theory, or you can test a testable statement meaning kind of a hypothesis about a relationship between two or more variables. Okay, once again, so sometimes we are testing the theory, sometimes we are testing your own, let's say, Andreas will not be happy with me right now, ideas or your own variables in order to see whether those relationships are existing or not existing. But what I would really want to say is that you need to write your hypothesis before you start your experiment or data collection, because usually based on the statement, the hypothesis statement, you will have to pick the proper methodology. Okay, and that's not just kind of important because of that, but usually we say you have to understand what is going on. You have to understand what are you expecting. And the hypothesis is saying exactly that. You know, we usually do not like, I mean, I never do that. We say that we are going fishing. That means you do research, then you see what is actually there, what you can prove, what you cannot prove. And based on that, you write the hypothesis. So that's not the proper way of doing research. As we said, you go actually deep, you understand what's going on, you predict something, and then you really test that that is there or it's not there. Okay, so please understand that before you start your experiment, the hypotheses have to be there because they are guiding how you will perform your experiment, what actually statistical tools or even models you will be using and things like that. So it has to be definitely before. Okay, let us maybe wrap up what is a hypothesis with the next bullet points. State your predictions about what your research will find. Okay, I guess that's clear. So if I go back once again to our framework, and we said implementation enablers are positively influencing sustainability exploration practices. So I'm clearly stating what I'm expecting. On the other side, now going maybe back to you, Zara, what we have started to discuss a few minutes ago, in a way, the hypothesis can be seen as a tentative answer to your research question. Okay, so you have your research question, and then you ask yourself, what is the outcome of this research question? And then you can actually start developing the hypothesis in that way, because you have to test the hypothesis. You are not testing the research question. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. In most of the PhD research, you will have more than one hypothesis. You will definitely write several hypotheses. As you see here, I just put now here 4 hypotheses, but this research has had actually many more hypotheses. So that was one of my PhD students, and I study actually, and we had here, I guess, 12 or 13 different hypotheses. Something else what I have even mentioned before, a hypothesis is not just a guess. That means you cannot just go out there and say, okay, I'll write that. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Because in, your supervisors will always ask you, they will request you, they will push you that you will be justifying your hypothesis. That means you will have to go through the literature, do a literature review and justify each of the hypotheses. That means most of the times you are not just coming with something totally new, but you are trying to develop and show how your hypotheses are kind of contributing to the knowledge. So in most of the cases, not in most, majority of the cases, or I would say 98% of the cases, some existing literature is there and you have to use it in order to justify your hypothesis, in order to justify why are you thinking that way? What is the basis that you can actually predict something within or with your hypothesis? And in the end, do not forget, as I said, I'll talk about that as well, that the hypothesis has to be testable. That means you have to have means, that means, let's say, statistical tools or any other way, let's say, qualitative tools in order to support or reject actually your hypothesis. Because if you cannot test it, that will not be a hypothesis. It has to be tested. That's actually kind of the prerequisite, or it is in the definition that you have to be able to test your hypothesis. So, any questions so far? I'm not sure that I'm so clear. So why are they important? Why are they so important? As we said, there is a link between your specific research question and the outcomes or the results, or as I said, sometimes you will be having actually testing over the theory, and that will be kind of showing whether the theory, a specific theory, is, for example, relevant for your research area, research topic as well. It helps, sure.
Nasreen is just asking, in which types of research is it necessary to include a hypothesis? So perhaps you could quickly reflect on it.
Okay, I was not checking perfectly fine. I was not checking the chat, sorry. Nasreen, usually we say that the hypotheses are linked to the quantitative research. Usually we are really kind of expecting that whenever a student writes a hypothesis, that this hypothesis will be tested using statistical methods. And then we accept it, not accept it, significant, not significant, and things like that. That's how we usually say. I'll talk a little bit about prepositions today. Sometimes we use preposition for the qualitative studies. But once again, whenever you write hypothesis, we will expect that that is tested by the means of statistical tools. Okay? It helps in data analysis, and it's important that whenever you will be doing that, especially as I said, using statistical tools, you will be definitely defining the validity and the reliability of your research. And through the hypothesis, actually, you can do that. And something else is important. The hypotheses do describe your research study in concrete terms. That means it is not just something, should I say, theoretical or in clouds, but in your hypothesis, you will clearly name the variables which are influencing the outcome. That means you will clearly say, let's say A is influencing B, or A is correlated to B, or something like that. Okay, so there is actually always a clear statement there which tells us what are we trying to show, what are we trying to test. Characteristics of a good hypothesis are quite simple. I mean, to be written, those 3 bullet points, but not so simple to be finally put down on the paper. It should be simple, so don't complicate. Everybody should understand what's in there. So it is kind of clear. It's a relationship, is a difference, is influence, or whatsoever it is there. Just make it clear that those 2 things are kind of linked together, and present them in a way, in a specific way. The next thing. Usually, you know, it happens many times that, let's say, students are writing in a way. I'll use a similar case afterwards. Eating apples and bananas will help you to, I don't know, whatever you want to. But you have to write it what? To get more vitamins. Usually you will say you cannot put apples and bananas together because you have to test it whether bananas are influencing your vitamin level or apples are influencing your vitamin level. So things like that. So be really specific. Tell exactly what are you trying to test. Tell exactly what are you expecting, what are you predicting to be the relationship. And I have spoken about that. It has to be written in advance because it will guide you, it will guide your way of thinking, and it will guide your finally methodology. Then I have mentioned a few times word variables. So that is kind of, I mean, most of you know it, so I guess I don't have to talk about it too much. But as I mentioned, a clear hypothesis will always has to kind of include the independent variables, so the variable which you are controlling, changing, but that means it's under your control, and the dependent variable, which is what you are kind of expecting to be the outcome, to be result, and that is what you are observing and measuring. And I'll talk about measuring a little bit later once again, because it's extremely important, maybe just now, it's extremely important that you're able to measure that, what you are saying, okay? Because if you are not able to measure it, then you will not be able to say, I approve this hypothesis or I reject this hypothesis. So it has to be there something, an instrument, which will give you the chance that you measure that. If you have a variable, for example, here, let us talk about daily apple consumption leads to fewer doctor visits. I guess that's quite clear. In our case, we have daily apple consumption, which is the independent variable. And this we are assuming is kind of, or suggesting, proposing, is leading to fewer doctor visits. And in this case, everything is clear. What are you doing? You're observing or changing or controlling the daily apple consumption, and then you are measuring how often the guys who have eaten more or less apples are visiting the doctor. Okay, so it's quite a clear thing. You have actually under control is the consumption, and on the other side, the outcome will be frequency of doctors. And that is kind of a clear hypothesis, and you exactly know what you have to do, how you have to do it, and what might be the outcome. You have even said leads to fewer doctor visits. So you are predicting that eating apples will kind of decrease the visits at the doctor. Okay, here's another chat. Okay, thanks. So I hope now it's quite clear what a hypothesis is. What do we mean under hypothesis? And let us now use few steps and try to understand how to write, finally, how to develop a hypothesis. I'll here present actually 6 different steps, and let us try to follow those steps and discuss them. The first one is kind of as a question. So where does it start? And that is once again the strong linkage to the research question. First, you will be actually defining your research question, because as we said, it guides your whole study, because you are trying to answer that research question. However, we do not test research questions. We use for that, for example, objectives, and the objectives can be tested using the hypothesis, or you can simply say, I have a research question, and through these 3, 4, or 5 hypotheses, I'll be trying to see whether the research question can be answered. And usually we say, yeah, I mean, the research question, well, we have another webinar or research question, so I will not go too deep into that. So try to join us actually at that day when we'll be talking about the research questions. The research questions should be focused, specific, researchable. I mean, that's clear. So let us go now to a sample or example of a research question. Do students who attend more lectures get better exam results? Quite a broad question, and we do not know whether that is true or not true. And we can go then even deeper. We can be with our hypothesis more specific. Let us talk about that right now. So the first thing is definitely the research question, because the research question guides you and kind of pushes you to think about the exam, about hypothesis. And as I have said, don't forget that your research question will guide you. You are kind of expecting your answers. But once again, do not forget that those answers have to be justified by the literature. So whenever you have a research question, you will have to read a lot. You will have to justify and support actually your research question based on the literature review. And the next stage then will be that using a specific, let's say, research question, as well as then hypothesis linked to this research question, will tell us whether this research question can be answered in a specific way or not. So after you have your research question, then the next step, as we have said in the beginning, will be theoretical or conceptual framework. Because in this theoretical or conceptual framework, you will be presenting the relationships. And here we go. The moment you have different relationships between different variables, because in your theoretical or conceptual framework, you will be using variables, and then you can start thinking, and then you can start telling us which of those variables will be tested using the hypothesis. So whenever you have your conceptual framework in front of you, then you will be saying, okay, I'll check these two, I'll check these two, I'll check how the context is, for example, influencing different relationships or something like that. It's really up to you. What is the focus of your study? After you have done that, then you can start formulating your hypothesis. As I said, you have your research question, based on the research question, you have your boxes, and now you will be telling us what do you expect that within the framework will happen. So what is the input, what is the output, and things like that. And based on that, you will be starting actually to be more specific, to show us what you want to really examine, what you want to test. If we go now to the previous research question, do students who attend more lectures get better exam results? Okay, one of the possible answers could be, I hope so. I mean, I really truly believe in that. Even attending more lectures leads to better exam results. That could be a broad hypothesis, but I don't like it too much because it is for me a little bit too broad. So I would like that you go a little bit further and you refine your hypothesis. Because as we said, you have to write it in a way that it is really specific to your research, to your study, as well as you can actually see on the basis of hypothesis that it can be testable. And I'll show that as well. You will be actually can use different ways how to phrase a hypothesis, but what is extremely important is that in this statement, as we said, hypothesis statement, different things have to be actually included. You have to talk about the relevant variables, which you will be kind of testing or showing whether there is a relationship or not. And then we can kind of describe in different ways what are we thinking that those variables are kind of linked together. You can use a specific group being studied. That means usually we say constructs. Constructs are kind of a combination or are a set, let's say, of variables. And definitely, as we said, the predicted outcome, which in our case is usually the dependent variable. As we have said here, we can easily say that sustainability practices are influencing the organizational performance. Could be quite a positively, let's say, influencing the organizational performance. Could be a clear hypothesis based on this framework. Or, as I mentioned before, we could say sustainability exploration practices are positively, significantly and positively influencing the performance output, for example. So, okay. Then the next stage is how you really finally phrase your hypothesis. And usually we write them in three general ways. The first one is that you say kind of simply if then. So you're predicting saying if that will happen, if that occurs, something will happen. So the first part will be usually talking about the independent variables, and the second part, that means the then part, will be kind of describing the outcome and is linked to the dependent variable. For example, and you see now we are going a little bit deeper, we are a little bit more specific with our hypothesis than the previous one, when we were just talking attending more lectures gives better results. Now we are saying if a first-year student attends more lectures, then his or her exam score will improve. So we went now to the first year, for example, because that was our, let's say, focus, that we see how the first-year students are working. The other way will be usually that we are talking about the correlations or effects. That means, as I mentioned before, we are predicting a correlation or we are predicting effect. For example, the number of lectures attended, that means the number of lectures, means you can measure, okay, how many lectures the student has attended, has a positive effect on their exam scores. So it is a little bit different, okay, because now we are talking about the number of lectures and it is clear what we are trying to measure here, what we are trying actually to research here. That means first year students, the number of lectures and the exam scores, kind of three different but extremely clear actually terms which will be tested. Or you can even compare, let's say, different groups, if that is actually your wish or your idea actually in your research. and then you can actually kind of search for differences within those two groups. And then you would write your hypothesis in a way. First-year students who attend most lectures will have better scores than those who attend few lectures. Okay, so you have two groups, one who is attending most lectures and the other one who is attending few lectures or less lectures. So that's kind of the three ways which can be generally used. But yeah, I mean, if you go a little bit deeper, you will be able actually to state them in a clear way, which is linked to your research. Then about a null hypothesis. I mean, usually, and it is correct to do that whenever we are statistically testing the hypothesis, that you are writing a null hypothesis as well. But I have to admit that I have read actually quite many PhDs where there were actually no null hypothesis included, because it is in a way just a default position. That means that the null hypothesis is kind of predicting no association. On the other side, when we're talking about hypothesis, it predicts kind of that there is an association, that there is actually a relationship between the two variables. So null hypothesis would be, in this case, there is no effect on their final exam scores. And I mean, the actual hypothesis we would like to test is there is a positive effect on their final exam scores. Okay, so that's kind of the way how we write the hypothesis. Any questions?
Can we test different hypotheses for the same research question at once?
What do you mean, Nasreen, with at once? We will definitely have, and I'll show you that actually a bit later, we'll definitely have for the same research question, different hypotheses. I mean, even if I go and use this case, you could go here and say the number of lectures attended by the first year has no effect. And then you could theoretically, just to explain or to answer your question, you could say attended by the second year, attended by the third year, and attended for the fourth year. And probably you would, I mean, that's my assumption, okay, based on my teaching experience, that probably that would be stronger, should I say stronger, true for the first year students. And for the fourth year students, probably there's not such a big need to be actually at every single lecture, because you have much more knowledge and you know more and you are more specific and things like that. So that would be the same research question, but you can test then, let's say, for each of the years, whether that is true or not. I don't know if I have answered your question. And definitely, we will have many hypotheses based as I said, many times. If I go back, let me go back to the framework. I talk about that later on, but let me explain to you. See, here I have 4 hypotheses and I have just one research question. And I could write even more hypotheses. I could go and say implementation enablers are positively influencing organization performance. Just on that box, let's say, on the construct of organization performance. Or I would be able to say implementation enablers are positively influencing performance output. That would be a second hypothesis. I could go farther and say implementation enablers are positively influencing the performance outcome. That would be the third hypothesis. And all of them still link to the same research question. And when I talk about context, it depends what is your context. Okay, could be competitiveness, let's say, in your industry, for example, could be, I don't know, influence of logistics, for example, could be uncertainty in your industry or something like that. And for that, you could have actually then additional 3, 4, or even more actually hypotheses. So I guess I'm trying to tell or explain or make it clear for you that, and I'm sorry, Zara, okay, that research question is rather broad. And based on the hypothesis, you will be definitely nail it down to what you want to show. and what you want to test. I don't know. Have I answered, Nasreen?
Sorry, yes, thank you, Professor.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, and now it's that what I wanted, what I have actually spoken for a while, so nothing new right now. I just presented, or I'm presenting another slide, rather for you. Maybe you can read it then. Actually, I don't want to go too deep into that. I was just trying to put together actually research question and hypothesis and the null hypothesis. And once again, I don't know. Can flexible work arrangement improve job satisfaction? That was the research question. And then you can actually put different hypotheses in here. You can say employees who have flexible working hours will report greater job satisfaction than employees who work fixed hours. Okay, I guess it's clear, the linkage between the research question and the hypothesis. But you can go deeper, and that goes once again back to your Nasreen. You can say employees who have 4 days working week will report greater job satisfaction than employees who work actually fixed hours. And then you could go deeper, and you could say, I don't know, outsource employees, for example, who work flexible working hours will report, or something like, okay, it's really up to you. As I said, using the framework where you are presenting your variables, and then your really focus of your research will be mirrored through the hypothesis. The research question is always a little bit broader, but then you go actually deep into that, and you are presenting your really specific research through your hypothesis. So I have mentioned a few times testable hypothesis. What is a testable hypothesis? How can we actually kind of see whether it is or not? Let us talk about that now for short few minutes. As we said, you have to have clear testable hypothesis, and now I'm presenting a short checklist which will give you a little bit indication. What does this mean? How can we actually kind of consider it or write it, develop it in a way that it will be testable? So first of all, the language should be clear and focused. So there's not a novel when you write actually a hypothesis, but it has to be kind of clear and really focused. And as I said, tell exactly what you want to test, and tell exactly what is the relationship, and which are the dependent and independent variables in there. So the language has to be clear. Are they really talking about what you want to do? As we said, if we are taking actually first year students. If you want to focus on the last year, then let's clearly talk about the last year students. If you want to talk about exam results, could be exam results. If you want to talk about something else, which could be linked to the being in the classroom, then talk about that. As I said, have to include independent variables, because you have to establish the linkage, you have to establish the relationship. Extremely important thing is, as we said, can those independent and dependent variables be easily identified and measured? Extremely important. I mean, if you cannot measure your independent and dependent variable, then you will not be able to test them. So that happens many times when we start discussing with the students at one point how we will be measuring their concepts, how we measuring their variables or their relationships. They many times say something which cannot be really measured, or it is too broad or something like that. So you will have to spend some time actually in order to understand how you can measure it. And literature will give you actually a lot of support in order that you will be able to measure things. I mean, many times we say don't try to develop new measurement scales, for example, to measure something, but use the existing ones because they have been already tested. And then can the hypothesis be tested through your experiment or to your research? That's another thing which is important. Are you able to do that? Do you have actually the means to do it? Are there methods which will be actually applied and you will be able to get actually results and see whether you can confirm or not confirm? And as we said, I mentioned that a few times, you have to kind of show what you are expecting. So you have to say, you have to include actually, for example, independent variable is significantly positively influencing the dependent variable or something like that, okay? And if that is not clear and is not clearly stated there, you will have to revise it. And it happens many times that, the students revise the hypothesis once, 2 or 3 times in order to make them really focused and to make them testable. So once again, regarding the testable, I spoke about that as well. So it must be possible that we say, okay, the hypothesis is true or the hypothesis is wrong, it's false. That means that we can reject it. And on the other side, the second criteria is that we are able to reproduce the results of the hypothesis, because usually we can even expect that some of the other researchers might actually follow our study in order to see whether that is, let's say, in their industry or in their environment true or not. And that means, or reproduce means that if they take actually the same data set, they will get the same results. So that has to be there. And here just a few examples. What do we understand under hypothesis is testable? For example, this one. The students who attend class have higher grades than students who skip class. That is clear. I will be actually measuring, observing actually the students who are in the class and then compare that in a way to the ones who were not in the classroom. 2 groups, and actually the outcome are the grades, and that's quite clear. You see everything. If you read that, it's totally clear what you want to do. And it even tells you what data you have to collect. And it even tells you, probably most of you, what statistical methods you can use in order to prove if that hypothesis is true or not. So it's quite a clear one. If I go to another one, it will not make us so happy because, for example, it doesn't matter whether or not you skip a class. I mean, that's definitely not a hypothesis because I do not understand what is it doesn't matter. And I have even no actually outcome. What does this mean? Does it mean that the results will be the same or whatsoever? You have to write it down clearly. What are you expecting that it will happen? I mean, theoretically, you could have it doesn't matter whether or not you skip a class and you will have the same result, for example. Okay, so you have to be kind of clear in what you want to do. Or here, ultraviolet light could cause cancer. I mean, don't use the word could because that's not clear. Just make it here. Causes cancer, for example, if you would write to do that. But even that is extremely not simple actually anyway to prove it. So be extremely specific. Never use words which are not clearly defined, which are not really clearly showing what you are trying to do. Because could is something what we do not like.
I've got a question here.
Sure.
Is the process the same for qualitative research?
In a way, as I said, you will probably not be using hypotheses because as I said, whenever you write hypotheses, it will be kind of expecting that you will be testing them unless you write that at one point and say, I will be using the hypothesis for the qualitative study. However, they will not be kind of tested using the statistical tools, but that is how I kind of shape, let's say, my expectations using the hypothesis. Usually we are kind of advising that students are using the preposition instead of hypothesis, because preposition says something a little bit in a different way. So for the qualitative studies or methodology, you will definitely have to prove something. You will have a research question. As I said, you might have propositions, and based on that, you will be definitely trying to show actually your results and support your results using actually your results, which will be, I don't know, maybe you will be using content analysis. Maybe you will be using, based on the content analysis, you can go actually a bit deeper, and you kind of, I won't say test, but you use statistical tools, let's say in vivo, in order to build topics and themes. And based on the themes which you have kind of expected or predicted in your research question, that will prove that that's correct, unless you have really exploratory study where you are kind of trying to understand the linkages. So that's the biggest difference between those two, qualitative and quantitative, is in that with qualitative study, you will many times trying to understand what's going on, and you will come up as a result with a framework. And then the next stage would be to take this framework, to write down the hypothesis and to test them on a adequately, let's say, large sample. Okay, I don't know if have I answered or not. Was it too fast? Was it not clear?
Yes, you answered. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. Now something about prepositions and hypotheses, just to make it actually kind of a little bit clear and make the distinction between the two. Preposition, and that is why we are many times linking it with the qualitative studies. It is kind of a statement explaining the logical linkage among the concepts. Concepts is now the critical word. Now the concepts, okay? And then we can say, okay, these thing which we are observing, these concepts, the linkage is there or is not there. So it's true or is not true. But that is without any empirical testing. Whenever we go one step further, we'll be testing actually the preposition, and usually we will have to reward it a little bit more and make it clear, especially in order that this preposition will become a hypothesis and will be able to be tested using statistical tools. Okay, so for example, treating employees better will make them more loyal employees. I mean, that's kind of a clear, let's say, preposition. We kind of understand those two concepts. Treating employees better will make them more loyal. But that is kind of just preposition. So you will probably not be able to measure it in a way to test it. If you want to go actually towards the hypothesis, you will have to talk about, for example, how to treat them and how you measure the treatment. And what do you mean under loyal? So you have to measure the loyalty as well. For example, that will be then the next stage. So we are trying to, as we said, write now a hypothesis based on the previous sentence. Treating employees better will make them more loyal employees. That's a proposition. And then theoretically, you could use actually the next hypothesis, which will be written in a way, giving employees one Friday off. And that means treating them better. That means then now you can measure this, that you give them one day off will result in, for example, lower employee turnover. And usually we say that, whenever the employees are more satisfied, let's say there's a lower turnaround. And that means that they are actually lower turnaround can be actually kind of expressing the loyalty. Okay, so the biggest difference here is actually that whenever we are talking about prepositions, we are rather talking about the concepts which have not been or cannot be really tested. But on the other side, whenever we are talking about the hypothesis, that is then quite clear that we can test them because we can measure them. And I'll show you actually on the next case. I guess everything will be quite clear. For example, if we take the impact on cars on air pollution, we can write a preposition which will be saying cars cause more air pollution. And I guess all of us understand those two concepts, and it's kind of clear that more cars are causing more pollution. But that's not so easy actually to test this preposition. So that's why we will say we have to operationalize actually those concepts and say, okay, cars can be translated, let's say, or operationalized through the number of cars. And then the air pollution can be generally, let's say, taken as CO2, CO or NOx or something like that, okay? It depends how you can actually really measure the emissions of the cars. And that is now the big difference. Here we are having a kind of a preposition with two concepts, and here we have two clear variables where we can measure the number of cars, we can measure actually the emission, that means the values in the air of CO, and based on that we can say, okay, it makes it true that the higher number of cars or the higher traffic will actually cause more CO in the air. Okay, is it kind of clear? Any questions to this?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, cool. Thanks,
It's pretty clear for me.
And that's the last slide, which is actually once again actually kind of aggregating everything. Prepositions, cars, and here as the number of cars increases, the amount of carbon monoxide increases. That would be kind of a clear hypothesis based or built upon a proposition. Okay. And that's actually the last part of our today's, I don't know, I'm talking and talking and talking. I'm sorry for that, but you're not cutting in. So that's why it takes even a little bit longer. And now actually maybe that link between the title, framework, research question, hypothesis. I mean, you know, I've been saying that so many times. I know I'm getting bored. I'm getting boring actually, but that's extremely important thing. The title, the framework, research question, and the hypothesis have to be aligned, and you have to see actually the thread, actually kind of thread throughout everything. Because under the thesis title, I expect something. When I see the conceptual framework, I expect definitely something. When I read the research question, it's clear what you are. I mean, for me, I'm at least trying to understand what you're trying to do. And when I see research question, conceptual framework, and then the hypothesis, everything's clear. And I even usually say, you know, for my students, when that is there, then actually it's no more work for me, because the methodology will be picked. It's clear what we have, what we need. I mean, the data will be collected, will be analyzed, and will be written. So that is just kind of, work, and not my work. Luckily, but students' work. But for me, the thesis is usually done when those things are really clearly aligned, because the rest, which I care for, is then actually the discussion. So let me take one of my PhD students' thesis, and let us just with 2 or 3 slides, just kind of try to explain what I was trying to tell you and show you. So the title of the thesis was The Influence of Sustainable Quality Management on Organization Performance. I mean, based on the title, you explain something. You expect the influence of sustainable quality management on organization performance. Then you read the research questions. original question, how does the deployment of sustainability exploitation and sustainability exploration practices affect organizational performance? So once again, you have organization performance in here, once here and once here. On the other side, when you read actually, then you will see that actually the sustainable quality management was operationalized through sustainability exploitation and sustainability exploration practices. So it's there. And then you go and check the framework. You see, here I have sustainability practices. Here I have organizational performance. Okay, the linkage is there. That's what the research question says. That means everything is kind of there. I'm happy with that. And then I go a little bit deeper. I add another variable and add some variables which are describing the context. And I have kind of split the organization performance into the output and outcome. For example, we could have even more here, but that was the conceptual framework. And now it's really up to you. What is your focus? Here you have some linkages indicated, but as I said, maybe that's not okay. Maybe you can take something else. Maybe you could actually, as I said before, implementation enablers influence organizational performance, or context influence on performance outcome, or something like that. Is really up to you. What are you trying to say? And that's the idea behind it when I said it has to be focused through your hypothesis, because your hypotheses are finally defining what you will be kind of doing, what you will be proving. And then the next slide will just say exactly that. We have seen the title, we have seen the research question, we have seen the framework, and now, as I said, some of the hypotheses are here, written in the, I hope, in a clear way. There's a positive relationship between sustainability enablers and sustainability exploration practices. Okay, so that is this one, or no, this one. I mean, we picked some other stuff, but I just brought some. Hypothesis H1A is actually this one. There is a positive relationship between sustainability exploration practices and organizational performance. That's another one, which is linking the exploration and performance actually here. And then the third one was, for example, higher levels of sustainability exploitation positively affect organizational performance to a greater degree than sustainability exploration when, and now we are bringing in actually the context when the environmental uncertainty is low, for example. And based on that, which one I choose it, because it's a little bit long one and maybe not clearly understood, but for the guys who are working, let's say, with performance and sustainability, it's quite clear, because the contribution was actually environment uncertainty. That was actually the contribution of this hypothesis. Any questions to this?
There's none in the chat room.
Okay, so the last slide. Don't give up, don't be disappointed, but sometimes can be disappointing. You know, what Newton said, disappointment is when a beautiful hypothesis is destroyed by an ugly fact. What I want to say is here, what does this mean, a beautiful hypothesis? Don't write beautiful hypothesis, okay? Write a hypothesis which are, what did we say? Testable, okay? That's important. And which are justified through your knowledge and through actually literature review. So beautiful hypothesis, that's not good enough. It has to be testable, because the facts will tell you whether you can reject it or hopefully prove it. And that was actually, I guess, the last slide from my side. So as I see, I was talking actually a little bit too much, exactly 1 hour. And that, yeah, depends how much energy you do have. But what I was kind of expecting is that we do, I mean, each of you try to put those 3 things together that you are taking your research question, that you are taking your conceptual or theoretical framework, and that you are trying to write one or two clear and testable hypotheses, and we could kind of, based on your examples, discuss whether those things are kind of clear or not clear. But it's up to you and up to the organizer. Jack is the organizer who will actually decide upon the next stage. Thank you guys being with me. I hope I was not too fast, and I hope you got some new information which will be useful for your PhD or any other type of research. Thanks.